Now we're going to go ahead and introduce the respiratory system. In this diagram, you can actually see some different parts of the human respiratory system. The respiratory center is located in the medulla oblongata and the pons, which is in the brainstem. The three major respiratory groups of neurons include two in the medulla oblongata and one in the pons. The hypothalamus regulates the rate and depth of breathing. Then we're going to be focusing on the pathway in which air flows as you breathe in through the nose and the mouth. We talked about the nasal cavity or the nasopharynx, nasal throat, or the connection between the nose and the throat. Then you have the oropharynx, which is the connection between the mouth and the throat. As it passes down the throat or the pharynx, it will not go down the esophagus, but it will be directed down the larynx. Then the trachea, and then branching off the two bronchi, and then the smaller tubes called bronchioles. Then it will end at the little air sacs called alveoli. At the alveoli, the little air sacs, you have capillaries or blood vessels that will pick up the oxygen and drop off carbon dioxide or other waste gases. So again, what is respiration? It's the exchange of gases between an organism and its environment. For humans, we are going to be taking in oxygen and excreting carbon dioxide. When we breathe in, we are not just breathing pure oxygen. We are breathing in carbon dioxide, we are breathing in methane, we are breathing in nitrogen, we are breathing in a whole different mixture of gases. Now, that is part of the respiratory system, to take in those gases, and then basically we are going to weed out when we transfer it to the cells. The cells are going to pick up oxygen, but we are going to get rid of those and we're going to breathe those out. So any waste gas that the cell is not using or that's still in the blood, we're going to get rid of. Now, aerobic cellular respiration, that's referring to what's happening in the cell. As we talked about cellular respiration, the production of ATP, glycolysis in the Krebs cycle, utilizing the glucose, the sugar, to make energy, we need oxygen for this to take place. So this is going to be called aerobic respiration. And remember, we can't move into the Krebs cycle and the ETC cycle without this oxygen. Lactic acid crystals are going to build up. If we don't have oxygen, that would be anaerobic. So again, oxygen is necessary for the Krebs cycle or citric acid cycle to occur. The citric acid cycle is another name for the Krebs cycle. A breath of air will pass through the following sequence, as we just showed in the diagram. You have the nostrils, the nasal cavity, then the pharynx, or we can kind of backtrack and say the mouth, then pharynx. So they're going to meet at the pharynx, then the larynx, then the trachea, then the bronchi, then the bronchioles, and then the alveoli. Let's break down what each of those things are, and I'm going to give you a little bit of a definition for each. The nostrils are two external openings of the nasal cavity that will take in or admit air into the body. The nasal cavity, it's a large air-filled space above and behind the nose in the middle of the face. It is the uppermost part of the respiratory system and provides the nasal passage for inhaled air from the nostrils to the nasopharynx, which is the connection of the nose to the throat area. The nasal septum means separation, divides the cavity into two shallow cavities or depressions known as fossae. So the septum of your nose is that little separation. So if you've ever seen a skull, that line, that piece of bone that separates the left and right opening, that is called the septum. Then you have the pharynx, which is the throat. This membrane-lined cavity behind the nose and mouth is commonly known as the throat. Then we're going to move to the larynx, which is the hollow muscular organ forming an air passage that directs air to the lungs and holding the vocal cords. So air is going to pass the vocal cords going down to the lungs. Now, the larynx is commonly known as the voice box. Then, instead of the esophagus, we're going to be moving down the trachea. The trachea is more rigid, where the esophagus will expand and contract. The trachea is a large membranous tube reinforced by C-shaped rings of cartilage. These rings of cartilage extend from the larynx all the way down to the separation or the bronchial tubes. They transfer air to and from the lungs. The trachea is commonly known as the windpipe. The trachea is then going to branch off into two bronchi. So each one is called a bronchus, and these are the air passageways to the lungs that separate from the windpipe or the trachea. So the trachea goes down and then separates into a left and right bronchi, into a left and right bronchus. The bronchioles are kind of like the tree branches or the roots that separate. These are the smaller branches of the bronchial airways in the respiratory tract that divide from the bronchi. So you have a right bronchi or bronchus, and then you have all these little bronchioles that branch off of that main tree. So same thing with the left bronchus, same thing with the left bronchus, you have all these little bronchioles that branch off. They do not contain cartilage or glands that the bronchi have. They keep dividing to deliver air to the alveoli. And what are the alveoli? Basically, this is the plural name for alveolus. These are the tiny little air sacs, the little tiny balloons that inflate and deflate, and these are the ends of the bronchiole. They allow for rapid gaseous exchange. So here you can see the structure of the alveoli at the end of the bronchioles, and you can see the capillaries that wrap around the alveolus, the arteries and veins. Remember, the veins are going to carry deoxygenated blood from the cells back to the heart. Arteries carry oxygenated blood away from the heart. So as we can see here, the blood is going to pump oxygenated blood. It's going to receive the oxygenated blood from the lungs, and then the heart is going to give it a big pump to the cells of the body. Drops off the oxygen at the cells of the body, and then basically the veins carry it back to the heart, give it a big pump to the lungs, and then we breathe out that deoxygenated blood filled with carbon dioxide. So again, this is just a diagram that's showing you red is the oxygenated blood filled with oxygen, the blue representing the vein, okay, is filled with more CO2 or it's oxygen depleted. And that doesn't mean half of my blood is going to be blue and half of my blood is going to be red. The veins that carry the oxygenated blood to the heart, these are called pulmonary veins. So pulmonary referring to the lungs. The pulmonary arteries are going away from the heart to the lungs, carrying the deoxygenated or high CO2 blood. So again, the pulmonary vein is going to the heart, but because it's going away from the lungs, it's carrying oxygenated blood. Then the pulmonary artery, after it came from the cells to the heart, it's carrying deoxygenated blood and getting pumped out, or that CO2 is being pumped out through the lungs. So the mechanics of breathing, so the process of inhaling and exhaling. Now remember, this really has to do with the diaphragm, not really the lungs. The lungs are like bags. The lungs are able to shrink and expand due to the pressure that's created in the pleural cavity of the chest. Now that pressure is vital. Without that pressure, the lungs would not be able to fill up. And as the diaphragm moves, it impacts the pressure inside the chest cavity. So when one inhales, the diaphragm is going to contract. It's going to tighten. It's going to move down. The lungs are going to then expand and the chest gets bigger or elevates. Now, when you exhale, the diaphragm is going to relax and it moves up. The lungs then shrink and the chest goes down. Now, the respiratory centers, as we've already said, the medulla oblongata and the pons, they regulate this respiration. And this is stimulated by chemicals and hormones in the brain, specifically an increase in hydrogen ions or a low oxygen concentration is going to stimulate this response of breathing, inhaling and exhaling. So it's basically our body telling us, okay, we need to breathe more to get more oxygen. You can look at this diagram, on the inhalation and exhalation process. And as we said, with the medulla oblongata and the pons, if there's an increase of hydrogen ions or a low amount of oxygen, there may even be a need to hyperventilate or breathe in more. Hyperventilation reduces the concentration of CO2 in the blood. Hyperventilation is a rapid and deep breathing, usually called overbreathing. It's when your breathing becomes too fast. Now, this can occur when someone is going through a panic attack or having anxiety. And then there's also decompression. Divers need to go through a process of decompression. This is something that is a rapid decrease in the barometric pressure, and this can lead to decompression sickness. Diving mammals have a high concentration of myoglobin in their blood. This is a red protein containing the heme or the iron that carries and stores oxygen in the muscle cells. It's structurally similar to hemoglobin. And so if someone is diving deep in the water, it's very important to make sure that they have the right amount of oxygen in their blood. Let's look at some respiratory diseases. Now, asthma is an inflammation of the lungs' main airways. This can be triggered by cigarette smoke. This can be triggered by allergies. So this is an irritation or swelling, a certain inflammation of the bronchioles. Bronchitis, again, affects the bronchioles. The inflammation of these air passageways leads to reduced airflow and heavy phlegm or mucus production. Chronic bronchitis is a long-term condition of shortness of breath and chronic cough, and smoking is a leading cause of this. Now, emphysema is basically, again, a result of cigarette smoke or smoking, and basically the tar in the cigarette causes an irritation of the alveoli, but it also reduces elasticity in the alveoli. So the alveoli, remember, are like little balloons. They blow up, but they're supposed to go back to normal or contract, and they don't. So the lungs lose their ability to transfer oxygen, so it can't blow up and go back to normal like it should. People with emphysema can't completely expel the air out of their alveoli, out of their lungs, causing shortness of breath. There's no cure to this, and the damage is irreversible. Now, many people who have emphysema may need to be given oxygen. You may see someone who is walking around with an oxygen tank and they have their tubes in their nose breathing oxygen because they can't do it themselves because of the loss of elasticity of their alveoli. And now we have lung cancer, which one of the leading causes of lung cancer is smoking. Okay, about 80% of all cases is because of smoking. This can spread to the bones, the liver, the brain, and the adrenal glands, which are above the kidneys. You can see the healthy lung, the smoker's lung, and the emphysemal lung. So the effects of pollution on the respiratory system, whether this is smoke from smoking, secondhand smoke or pollution in general if you live in a major city. So this does impact the respiratory system. Now, the respiratory system does have cilia that will try and move mucus out of the body. A lot of smokers that quit smoking, they will be coughing up a lot of phlegm, a lot of mucus, tar, a lot of material from what was kept in their lungs. And this will happen for quite a few years. The ciliated mucus lining, that lining in the lungs traps the inhaled particles. As we said, the pollution will cause bronchial contraction, so the bronchial tubes will get tighter, okay? And then that will decrease the amount of airflow. It will also increase mucus secretion, so you get more mucus in your lungs. You're going to be coughing up. That's also going to block a lot more of the air as well. So you're not only having the bronchioles getting tighter and smaller, so the space is getting smaller. Now it's filling up with mucus. And then pollution can also damage the cilia on the cells. And then there's heavy coughing,